failure teaches us far more than success does. And it is the gateway to so many future successes. And I think that was probably one of the best things about wrestling, was that it made me very comfortable with failure and comfortable with crisis and comfortable with the fact that like we were talking earlier about the pandemic, when you're in that situation, where there's kind of no playbook, you have to become very comfortable with rewriting it and coming up with a whole new one.
I'm Mark Cook, president of Windfall Partners. We get leaders unstuck and thriving with their teams. After turnarounds as chief executive, the largest ever studies of award-winning leaders, a New York Times bestseller, and 5-star keynotes. I've coached 4,000 client wins at top brands. My Bold Encounters is an advanced system for leading. First, powerful steps on a path forward. Second, problem-solving skills that beat obstacles fast. Now, lead with Bold Encounters today. Welcome to Bold Encounters. I'm Mark Cook, and I am thrilled today to have with me Mark Thorpe. I ran into Mark Thorpe through a common friend, and he was the CEO of Ontario International. But he's also been in leadership at Dallas Fort Worth and the famous LAX airport. And back then, when we started discussions and putting this together, we were coming off our 10th effort to get out of pandemic. And boy, if anyone's faced getting stuck or figuring things out, it's been an airport during a pandemic. And I thought I need to get a hold of that guy, because so many business people travel so much and we want to hear the secrets behind the scenes and the tips and the tricks. We also want to hear how someone that gets stuck in the middle of a random pandemic as an airport CEO navigates that. Now he works as a consultant with that terrific resume, 2 airports. And he's got a great background we're going to discuss too. How are you doing, Mark?
Well, how are you, Mark?
Good. I'm so glad you'd come.
Sure, glad to be here.
Yeah. I want to start in your professional life, that timeline, but in your personal life. I want to ask you the mixture of 2 things that converge to be very difficult. Did you ever have something that was maybe one of the most difficult trials you've ever had that impacted both?
I think you brought up it, and it sounds like it's kind of maybe a little obvious. I mean, I could talk about some other challenges too. In general, you can think of almost any failure and talk about the lessons learned from it. But the pandemic itself, I think, because it's such a universal experience, is a good one to look at. Because I think for all of us, it was this combination of had a massive impact on us professionally, but immediately at the same time on our families and homes. I mean, I'm a parent of 3 kids. All 3 of them were still at home at the time. And, just the world completely turned upside down. There are a lot of silver linings, but, I was in a situation where, with my job, I had to go to work every day, and we had a lot of people staying at home, but, half of our people are at an airport or showing up for work. We had a lot of people catching COVID, just by virtue of being at work around other people. And I felt like it wasn't really right to have, half our folks go to work and the other half, stay at home. I wasn't going to, stay at home that whole time. So I went, every day and was there at the office and pretty involved with it. It was an interesting experience just because, I'm in an industry where with aviation, global aviation, the global economy or even a national economy catches a sniffle, aviation gets a full blown pneumonia. It's 9/11, first the Gulf War in the early 90s and then, the 2000 financial crisis with the stock market, overinflated values and the decline in the stock market then, global financial crisis, 2008, 9/11, I mentioned already, I guess, the pandemic. And now with, pretty strong inflation in the U.S., worst we've had in 40 years or so, every time there's these economic cycles, typically it's been like every 7 years or so. Last decade or so, it's gotten more compact, some of the cycles. But every time there's those cycles, aviation is heavily impacted because it's driven by, GDP growth and population growth and those kind of things that, people don't have income, they're not traveling as much. So even, and in the pandemic, the thing that was different about that was everything shut down. I mean, we lost 80%, 90% of the traffic overnight. And it was incredible. It was not, usually you could say, well, there'll be full recovery within about 18 months. That was looking at the pandemic. It was there was no idea I had no idea how quickly it was going to come back from it. And the interesting thing, to talk about a specific instance, Ontario is one of the few repatriation airports in the United States where people we're bringing back citizens from the U.S., bringing them home, where we bring them to, there's only a handful of airports where they can go to. And so we were supposed to have the first flight of Americans out of Wuhan come to Ontario.
Oh, dear.
And so we'd worked with the county health department and everything, set up a space for them in a hangar. We had cots. We put in big screen TVs because it was going to be Super Bowl weekend then, early in 2020. And we're all ready to handle them and accommodate them. And then all of a sudden, I think everybody realized the public was completely, it was the public response to the COVID virus was something I'd never seen. I'd worked at LAX during SARS and SARS 1 and then swine flu, and COVID, of course, the pandemic was SARS 2. And it had been something, the Asian region, people in the Asian region had taken those pandemics very, very seriously. But the rest of the country outside of LAX, you didn't see people going through airports with masks or anything like that, like you would in Asia. But with the SARS 2, it was immediately clear that the public, we had people posting on social media, I'll never fly to this airport if you bring that flight through here. And, and I think we all, realized very quickly, this is not probably appropriate to bring this flight here. So we had to work with members of Congress and with the Department of State and Department of Transportation to actually move the flight to a military base nearby. But that should have been kind of an indicator that this was different than anything before. And it was an interesting challenge because, at work, you'd go and try to turn things, around, figure out how you're going to, respond to this really unique, different challenge that there was no playbook for. But then you come home and it's the same thing. I know I'm not the first to say it, but man, our young people paid a huge price with the pandemic. And you'd come home from work every day and it was, how do you, you're not a therapist to your kids, but man, their world was completely turned upside down. Just that idea of emotional resilience at home, at work. How do you help them respond and see opportunity in what is really just kind of a bleak situation for them? And our family actually, it was great in both respects. It turned out to be a great thing. I think as an organization, at work, we were able to. The good thing about those kind of any kind of event like that is you're free to rethink everything and look at everything and free to kind of say, well, because there is no playbook, we got to write one. And so, you can look at your business very differently, your personal life very differently. And I think there was a lot of positives that came out of the pandemic, professionally and personally, from that.
Let me back up before you get into the positives yet. Let's explore just a little bit what happened in your personal situation at work, leading such an organization. So if you take yourself back, describe the moment before any of this news came out. What was going on at your airport and in your work life?
So Ontario Airport here in Southern California had been part of the same airport system as LAX for 40 years or so. And then in the early teens, there'd been an effort for the local communities out here to bring Ontario back to local ownership and control. That had never really happened before in the United States. There's not only a few instances where one community has handed its airport, in terms of ownership and operational responsibility to another city to do that. So that was kind of pretty rare in the first place, but then it was extremely rare to have that community come and try and bring it back to the airport after decades having that kind of relationship. So that had all happened. And, the agreement was reached in 2015 and President Obama signed a law, that allowed the transfer of the airport to happen. So it changed hands again in the fall of 2016. I came back to Southern California as part of that initial leadership team. And there was a lot of excitement around everything, but it was a big challenge to take an organization that was staffed by City of Los Angeles employees, several hundred employees, and build a whole new organization. So that to do that, to start really from scratch, build up a whole new team to take on everything that had been done before while the airport remained operational, and then at the same time, there was so much growth because those inland areas in the Los Angeles area is where the growth's happening in Southern California right now. It's where they're actually the only parts of the southern half of the state where more people are moving in than moving out. You have a lot of people from the coast moving inland because they can afford homes. So we had a pretty good demographic wave, and things were bouncing back. We had a lot of cargo growth because it's, that inland area is, because the warehouses and distribution centers, one of the most important places in the world for certainly e-commerce and everything. We had FedEx wanting to build a hub, and Amazon, with their new airline expanding, they had an air hub there and they were looking to grow there. So we had a lot of opportunities to grow on projects. And so it was a really, it was exciting, and it looked like, there was the promise of the airport that the local communities had felt had not been delivered on or realized under that previous relationship with Los Angeles. And it wasn't an acrimonious relationship. It was just, they felt like they could do more with it, under local control, because you can only have one, top priority, right? So, and you're never as high a priority as LAX when you're in the same system as LAX. So it was just feeling that we're starting to realize a lot of the potential of that airport. And then the pandemic hits, and it's like, screeching halt.
Tell me, go to the exact moment, like you knew one, you did not know one moment, and then how did you find out, and describe those set of moments right then?
Honestly, I was kind of just, one of the downsides of being in an industry for a long time in your career is you think, I've seen this movie before, this is Star Wars Episode 8, right? I know exactly what George Lucas is going to do in every one of these little three series vignettes, right? I can tell you, it's 18 months, we'll be out of this thing. I think it was actually when I realized we had our local member of Congress looking to get other members of Congress to sign on to a letter asking the Secretary of State to move the flight, that pandemic, expatriate flight to a military base. Then I realized, man, this is a whole different. The world's seeing this pandemic differently, and this is not going to be like anything I've seen before in my career. The funny thing, though, was, coming at it right from the start, we were fortunate at that airport. Again, I mentioned, it's arguably as important as any other airport in the United States for e-commerce, certainly in the western half of the United States. It's one of the probably 5 to 10 most important airports in the world. People don't realize it, but it's a top 10, I think number 9 or 10 in North America for air cargo. And it's express freight, which is very different from what's in the belly of a passenger flight. A big wide body passenger flight from London, may have a lot of cargo in it, but FedEx, UPS, Amazon, they carry very different, not just express packages, but a lot of e-commerce, things that people have bought. And so when the global economy shifted to buy from home, pick it up on the doorstep, we had explosive growth. And so on the cargo side of things were really, really, they really took off during the pandemic. We also had a lot of business travel because you had a stronger business travel base, not a lot like compared to 2019 for sure, but we had a lot of business travel because that was one of the industries that really was humming. And it was one where people had to be there and be on site, and, people were flying back and forth. Fortunately, FedEx had just completed by the fall of 2020, they were able to complete a new hub, $330 million facility they built. They were close to being done when the pandemic hit, so they didn't have to derail that, and they finished it that year. But, it was interesting that on the one hand, the passenger side of the business really just fell through the floor. But on the other hand, we were fortunate to be, because of the pandemic, in a situation where what was already pretty strong growth and, acceptance and acceptance, penetration of e-commerce activity, in the American economy, that just like went forward. It was it was turbocharged all of a sudden. So, we were lucky in that sense, but at the same time, you can't lose that much passenger traffic. You make a lot more revenue as an airport from people than you do packages, right? So our revenues were extremely challenged without the passenger traffic, and we had to completely, rewrite the playbook on how we resolve that issue.
Let me ask you this: in this, it seems like a 2-pronged challenge. You've got to completely change the mix of kind of your product, so to speak. And you have the reduction of revenue, the highest revenue, most profitable revenue. What was the first challenge that you faced in heading to a better place? What did you run into, or what hit you first, and what did you have to struggle through to solve as kind of the sub challenge?
Well, immediately we were fortunate because in some other parts of the world, airlines and airports were not. And I say fortunate because I say fortunate with a lot of gratitude because I know it came at the cost of taxpayers. I mean, the aviation industry, a lot of people go, taxpayers, airports actually typically don't cost taxpayers anything. They're paid for by users, by airlines, by people. When you fly through and you pay your PFC fees, the $450 charges that, we always see on the, you pay for the airfare and then the taxes and fees seem to be just as much as the airfare. You're a user at the airport is paying for that. Where we lease the space to the tenants that use it, and airlines pay for the facilities that they're in. You're paying for parking. All those things mean that the local, community and as federal taxpayers, we're not paying for airports. So, typically we're not a burden on the people in that way. But with the COVID pandemic, because the government really shut down aviation by and large and really restricted who could travel, and our federal government in the relief packages, gave money to airports and airlines and kept those industries afloat. But, to me, though, it was one of the few times that maybe the only time in my career I'll see taxpayers having to, take that burden. And I mean, I'm one of them. Right. So to me, it was kind of it was an important thing to not just take that for granted. So we try to be really careful with the funds we received. But at the same time, that wasn't when it was clear that this was going to be a pretty difficult multi-year slog to climb through. You can't sit and say, oh, we'll just, we're fine now. We'll just go for a third and a fourth round of government assistance. Excuse me, it's pretty clear that you can only, when there's a T at the end of those spending bills, there's only so many rounds in the chamber, right? I mean, you can't keep doing that again and again and again. So we had to really rethink our commercial strategy and move away from the typical historical dependence on parking or, food and beverage expenditures by our passengers, or, them renting cars at the airport, that sort of thing that typically airports get most of their revenue from. We had to think differently about some of our existing relationships, with advertising and sponsorship. Were there ways to do that, more effectively? By that, I mean, where we could generate more revenue and keep more of the revenue we generate. Could we develop some of the real estate that we had that was developable as industrial real estate? Can you create new revenue streams? Kind of what I said earlier about you have no playbook. So you start to look around and say, I mean, I kind of, it's a bad metaphor, but it's kind of you looking under the couch cushions for change sort of thing. Okay. But then you're all in, how can we not just recalibrate some things, but reorient our approach in bigger ways to find other revenue streams that are not so dependent on the cyclical nature of travel. If you can lease more, real estate doesn't, lease payments are due, whether, there's a pandemic or not. And, we had real estate to develop, and we were fortunate to have that market position with e-commerce to have, a lot of demand for that kind of real estate in Southern California because of its geographic importance to the global economy and supply chain for e-commerce and express deliveries.
Was there a make or break moment where it got a little tenuous and nerve-wracking and you wondered and you had to work to make it through? Is there a period of time that it was like that?
I think the hardest period, it wasn't, I can't think of necessarily one moment, but I think it was probably when I started to realize, how many of our employees were sick with the coronavirus, and more importantly, we had a lot of young people, and people in operations at airports. A lot of them tend to be a little bit younger, and they have the energy level and they were the kind, you're thinking, if anybody's not going to get sick, it's going to be them. I sort of had that cavalier attitude a little bit, these are people in good health, but then I realized they were going home to families and, and in some cases living with, in multi-generational homes with grandparents and then I realized just the real personal impact of of trying to keep the airport going and the business running.
Yeah,
that was hard because then those decisions became more than just and I don't know that I'm generally just that I don't think I'm unsympathetic in general anyway. But then you really have to start to take more of a personal. You have to take into account more of those personal issues when you're making those business decisions.
Yeah, facing the lives of families of people that you've known for a long time.
Yeah, that's a ton of cost that doesn't show up on a balance sheet, but it's probably more important than what.
Well, it's noble how you did it. Do you have a particular employee that's an example of that? Can you think of someone that you've become pretty close to, and they faced a difficult challenge because of all of this, and they're facing both an airport situation in a pandemic and a home situation in a pandemic?
Well, I mean, just in general, I think we had one of our employees who, had. Well, one of the tough things too was you had employees who. One of the tough thing, one difficult thing was people had a lot of reasons to when you got into vaccines, and because airports and airline employees are some of the first folks to be eligible to get the vaccines, and there was this balance of you really had no right or business to know about people's health histories, and B, I didn't want to. It was their business. So I don't even need anybody knowing mine. But even with those things in mind, now suddenly you had people who didn't necessarily want to get a vaccine. You had people who had really big concerns about, I think one employee in particular, well, two, one had some his own personal immune system issues that made that person hesitant to want to have vaccines. And then you had another employee with a family member who was going through some medical procedures and therapies that made it extremely difficult for that family to have people anywhere outside the house. It was a difficult. I think about in both those cases how hard it was to implement a one size fits all kind of solution to things, but also be in an industry where you really couldn't. You had some people who it was tough to say, well, there were a lot of decisions like that. I think about those two in particular, but you had to have people there to make the airport continue to work. And frankly, our airport was really important because it did actually mean people could, it was feeding and clothing people, and certainly in the western half of the United States and really throughout the whole country, because so much trade was coming through the airport. If you didn't have people there to help keep the airport operating, you don't have the stuff that UPS and FedEx and Amazon were bringing through the airport, right? So, and the same's true with their own employees. So you have this challenge of you really need people there to be able to do the job, but you also have to be very sympathetic, and you need the vaccines for people to be able to do so without having more and more people be exposed and be sick, which would further hamper the ability of the airport to operate. But you don't want to, you also want to be very respectful of those individual cases where people really need that flexibility and need that ability to not have a one size fits all approach to things. So it was hard. It was hard for really over a year to deal with those kind of challenges on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. Has it started to come back? Are you through the major challenges? I mean, it seems like it's been over for forever now for where I live, but I know California is very serious about it all, and it feels like it's come back a little bit.
Well, and for Ontario, I mean, look, it wasn't the biggest airport in Southern California. I think it's third behind LAX and John Wayne, but Orange County Airport, but it had the fastest recovery rate in Southern California. I think and mainly due to just the strength of that economy being centered on transportation logistics, supply chain management, distribution, but also the population growth and the demographics. You had a younger, it was important to me to walk around the terminals and see who's flying in and out. I know that's kind of anecdotal evidence, but sometimes that's, just as important as any surveying or other quantitative analysis you can do, it was pretty young. The population out there is younger. People were less afraid to, fly. Generally speaking, people that live in close to the coast are able to do so because they tend to be a little older and have money and accumulated wealth. Inland, it was a younger demographic. So, I think that was part of it as well, but mainly the economy. But traffic was back pretty close to 2019 levels, not too far into the pandemic. But the challenge again is, in that kind of national aviation system, you can't say, well, Florida's really healthy and New York and California are in the dumps. Salt Lake's doing great, but Denver's not, right? So you have these different approaches by different states in terms of the ability to do business, go to school. That was part of it. So, for tourism, obviously, Florida was much more open. So there were a lot of really successful, areas of the country. And then it was kind of a haves and have-nots. But even, for an Ontario, the national system still needs an LAX and a SFO to do really well, and a JFK and Chicago. And so that's been part of the problem, still limping along out of the pandemic is, you haven't had the same recovery in the LAXs and SFOs. And, you look at it from an airline perspective, it's what I think 90, some of the big network carriers, American, Delta, United, the large majority of their traffic touches their hubs. So you can't have really slow recovery in those hub markets and have those airlines really come back to full great health. So that's still something we struggle through. It's not one of those where, I think you look at other airports as competitors, but you also can't say, we're doing great and you guys aren't. Well, eventually that's going to be an albatross for you, right? So it's a little bit more of a confederation than a full out, Darwinist, commercial survival of the fittest type of approach.
Well, it's fascinating. Before we leave airports, I want to switch horses a little bit before we dramatically shift. And you're an insider. You know this whole business. You're an operations expert. Those of us that travel, give us your 5 top tips to make life better personally and selfishly for a traveler.
I think, the first thing, everybody's main concern is airfare, right? So, first thing I'll say before I get to that tip, I would tell people to stop necessarily thinking just about airfare and think about the total cost of your travel, the value of your time, right? So sometimes, for example, full disclosure, I'm working for an airport up there in Utah that's not Salt Lake City. Sometimes look at some of those secondary airports and think about, not that the airfare is always higher necessarily, but you look at, in a market where you have secondary options, look at every airport. Don't just consider, well, this one may not have, like in Southern California, it's a great example. And I love LAX, spent 9 years there. It's one of the great airports in the world. It's one of the most exciting places to fly through, but it's one of the least exciting places to drive to, right? So where I live 40 miles away, I live a little bit less than that, 30 something miles from LAX. I live 40 miles from Ontario. So you have sometimes think, what's the total cost? How much? Yeah, I can save $200 on airfare, but I'm going to spend 3 hours on the freeway. And the airfare might be cheaper, but how much more is parking per day? That kind of thing. So that's the first tip is don't just think about where you can get the least expensive airfare. Take into account everything, do the math for the whole trip, and think about your time, especially business travelers, because, as my dad used to say, you're cutting a fat hog in the backside when you think, I got a lower airfare, or I can have a flight I get schedules important, but I would look at everything related to that travel and value your own time in there. And even with families, we think, well, God, it's $200 cheaper a ticket. But sometimes you almost destroy the trip coming and going for the family by, the traffic. Now that's not true in every place, but certainly some of the big cities where there's multiple airports, I think you should look at all your different options and take into account your mental health and the experience of getting there, the predictability. You can say, well, I have a flight every hour on the hour to go from here to here at the airport. Okay. But you can also miss that flight by sitting in traffic. Right. So, having been in Salt Lake a few weeks ago, I can say the traffic's not LA traffic, but it's getting worse and worse everywhere. So, if you're sitting down in Springville or Provo or Alpine or something, you may not always want to look to go all the way to LAX or something, So, to Salt Lake or something. So that's kind of the first tip. The second thing is if you're flying, looking for good airfares, the best days of the week are usually probably Tuesday to Thursday to look at. Mondays and Fridays are your business travelers, road warriors. Sunday nights, same kind of thing. So kind of know the days of the week and times of the day, and you can see that now. One of the great things the last 20 years that I've seen in my career is all the power has shifted to the consumer because of the internet, because of technology. What used to have to go through a travel agent, now you have it in your own hands. So you can do all that comparison shopping. But one of the easy ways to find the better fares is just look certain days of the week, and that's why they always steer you to, are you willing to travel a different day? Well, you can kind of start that out by just knowing what days of the week are going to be the ones where the most seats are going to be sitting empty, and therefore you'll have the lower airfares. Another value 1 to 5. One of the things with parking that's changing now in the U.S., because that can actually be a pretty big expense. A lot of people look at the off-airport parking. A lot of airports that are smart have moved into, using pre-booking tools where you can pre-book the parking ahead of time and get a better fare. And they're basically doing what airlines do. They're just inventory managing. We did that at Ontario. A lot of airports are doing it now. I think we were the first or one of the first to do it in the U.S. But basically, we know we have unused inventory based on historical, parking data from the last X number of years, and we know on Tuesday, May, what'll it be next week, 24th, we tend to have the lots 60% empty. Well, we would sell those things at $7 a day, right? So it's even lower than off-airport parking.
That's interesting. So you pre-purchase rather than just go through the gate and get charged much more.
And that may be another tip is people don't tend to go to airport websites. They tend to go to the airline websites. And sometimes, especially if you're kind of a nervous traveler or if you're looking to really understand, how to save the most amount of time, go to the airport websites. A lot of times airports will show you what the average delays are at TSA screening. You can figure out, Salt Lake, I noticed, there's very different wait times at TSA and different times of the day. And, I'm just, I have nothing else to show up 2 hours early. Well, I squandered, a lot of that time waiting in a TSA line. So, the airport will tell you different times of the day. You can see when there's a lot of now, there's suggestions of, you don't need to be here, 2 hours early. There's peak periods in the morning and in the evenings for TSA screening and wait time. So I think it's always good to go to the airport's websites before you travel.
What about some of those express? It used to be for high frequency travelers. Now you're selling them and interviewing for them. Tell us the inside scoop on that and your wisdom about that, because even some of us that travel a lot go in and out of using those services.
The express, like
the security line, the various commercial and airport express lines.
That was going to be one of the last tips I gave. So a lot of people have enrolled in Clear. I think the better deal is to just do TSA PreCheck. PreCheck is a great service to be in. Clear, you're handing over to a private company a lot of your biometric data and information, and it depends on how comfortable you are or not with that. The TSA, you're doing the same thing, but it's to the government. I kind of think, well, they probably already have it about me anyway. But anyway, what it does, it just makes you a trusted traveler, so you can go through. I've been a proponent and a member of PreCheck for almost since it started. But if you travel internationally, the better deal, it's $100 for 5 years for TSA PreCheck. But the better deal is actually to go through global entry with U.S. Customs and Border Protection. You have to go through an interview. You have to tell them where you've lived everywhere you've lived the last 10 years. They do more of a background check on you, but you get the same kind of expedited service when you come back from an international trip. And that is worth it. Even if you're only traveling international once every, 1 or 2 years, or if you're ever traveling international with your family, it's absolutely worth it because you go right to the front of the line and can go through the customs screening part of the process.
Do you get benefits for when you travel domestically with that?
Yes, you do. So I was just going to say, when you pay, it's the same, $100 fee, I think, for 5 years, and you get TSA PreCheck. So you're paying the same amount of money and you get both. I think it's worth it to do both together. Even if it's, I don't travel internationally that often. If you're going to travel once in every 5 years, why not do it? Because you still get TSA PreCheck anyway. But I do think TSA PreCheck is absolutely worth it. Clear, I don't think it's fair for me to have an opinion or state my personal opinion on it. I think it just all depends on, the individual, that wants something that's, I don't even know if I can say that it's superior to TSA necessarily. It's just, that wants an even shorter line than TSA PreCheck. But my experience has been TSA PreCheck's pretty short. Pretty short.
When you're going into that situation with TSA PreCheck and you want to do the global version again, I would have guessed that if I go do a Google search for that, I'm going to get all sorts of third parties trying to help me with it and such. Where could a listener go to this that they know they're getting to that global option and it's really the government?
So you just look up global entry and it'll be I think it goes GOESS or something like that. It'll link you to, if it's not ending with a .gov, you're not in the right place. TSA and DHS have both done a pretty good job of commercializing those websites. And if you do a Google search and put, global entry, U.S. Customs, or even U.S. Customs Border Protection, it'll take you to the right page. Just, make sure it's one that is the government's page, and it'll say on there Department of Homeland Security, Customs and Border Protection. You'll know where you're at, just like if you end up, at irs.gov. And there's not a lot of flash and excitement to that page. They're not immediately asking for your credit card. They're asking for your information.
Like you said, they already have it. I had my wallet stolen on a run once in Seattle, and when I went to the airport, boy, I was shocked at what they knew about me. And by the way, I got through the line faster than the rest of the people in security, which I thought was interesting. It might be another tip. Lose your wallet, go through the interrogation. You'll probably get through security faster. Before we switch horses, any last warnings of mistakes we're making? I pressed you on these tips. You don't need to do 5. Do you have one more? Don't do this mistake, or this is a great tip?
I think one of the things that is, I think everybody kind of knows it, especially in this day and age of cell phones. I think it was Bill Riley just got caught yelling at a JetBlue employee a few weeks ago. I tell everybody, keep in mind when we're all frustrated with travel, but the person that you're going to be most frustrated at is always, unfortunately, the ticket counter person or the gate agent for an airline. Those are the last people that deserve to be yelled at. I mean, none of us are happy. You're better off getting on the phone. And even if you have to wait 45 minutes, first of all, your blood pressure will come down. You may not be as angry by the time you do talk to somebody. But second of all, they can probably handle that in a call center somewhere much more easily than, some of these poor, folks who, I think 90% of unhappiness and anger at airlines are dished out on these people who really just have no control over it. They are not the pilots of the plane. They're not air traffic control. Keep in mind when we're frustrated at an airport, keep in mind there's a lot of decisions that aren't even in the airline's hands. You have the FAA that's sitting there saying planes can or can't come in and out of an airport. You have a runway that may or may not be plowed. I mean, we all think our schedule is the most important thing, but in the aviation industry, safety and security is always going to take precedence. So sometimes your flight's canceled or it's delayed. Yeah, it might be because of pilot issues or shortages or things like, those are really true issues. Pilots are out with COVID, crews out with COVID. But a lot of the times it's also just weather related, security related, safety related. And your alternative is, do you want to be on that flight and have it be your last one? I mean, I'm not trying to be melodramatic either, but this is not like getting in your car and going to the grocery store, even though it's the safest way to travel by far. Mathematically, you're safer in a plane than any other way of moving around the world or the country. It's still it's still something it's not the same as, moving yourself on the ground, right? I mean, there's a lot that goes into aviation, and the last thing that is going to be compromised is by anybody in that whole process, airports, airlines, the FAA, TSA, is going to be security of the people that are on the plane.
I want to be respectful of your time, but I want to ask you about 9/11 just for a second. We only have a few minutes, but maybe we could condense it by letting me ask you this. What was the most intense, troubling moment during 9/11 as an airport executive? And second, what was the most profound reflection that you've had through the years after?
Interestingly enough, I was in the industry. I was pretty new to the industry, probably 4 or 5 years up in law school, business school. Had always, my whole career's been in aviation. At the time, I was a management consultant in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we actually lived right by SFO. So I woke up that morning. I was going to go out for a run and stretching in the front room. My wife and I did not have any kids at the time. She was getting ready to go teach the school, and I was, in there getting ready to go out and run, and I looked on the news and I saw that a plane had hit the World Trade Center, and they said, "Oh, it looks like it was a small plane." And I immediately looked at it and I knew that's a little plane wouldn't do that. A general aviation aircraft would have bounced off the world. I'd been in the World Trade Center before. I mean, and anything, the smallest bit about the engineering in that building, and a GA aircraft would have probably just bounced off that and fallen to the street.
Broken a window and hurt a cell, but then bounced off. Yeah.
And there's a fire, and you think that's got to be bigger than any kind of plane like that. And so I stayed and was watching it. And then I watched the second plane hit. And two things I remember. Number one, I went into work that morning, and we found out that we had our own, some of our own consultants. One of my good friends, one of my colleagues at the firm, he was in New York to go work with one of our clients, the Port Authority, and the people he was supposed to meet with were in the South Tower. They had gone to their control center in the South Tower because the Port Authority owned not just the trade center towers, but also the airports, owns and operates the airports, the tunnels in New York. I joke that it's second only in power to God. The Port Authority is this massive organization, and some of our clients our clients that were in the airport division were there in the ops center at the South Tower, and that was the South Tower had already come down and came down first, and they were in the floors that were above where the second plane had impacted. And then I remember later in the day seeing fighter jets, escort planes coming into SFO when they were landing, and just that shutdown is very different from the pandemic. And, there's a whole generation of Americans that, are young people that don't remember that. It was different in that was immediately, it was like martial law in aviation. I mean, airports just shut down. It didn't last long. It was just a number of days before airlines could start flying again. We had consultants in our firm that were in, industry events in Montreal that had to rent cars to drive across country to come home and find other people that would drive with them. It was a real shock for a few days. But what I remember most that was so unique about that experience was, even myself, I mean, I sit there and think, even when there's turbulence in a flight, I get nervous. But I think, this is like hitting a bump in the road kind of thing. I don't have a lot of anxiety about flying, but I did for a long time. I remember the first time I got into, about a long time for me was, probably 6 months to a year. I remember even the first year of anniversary of 9/11, I think I had to travel somewhere for work. I remember how empty that plane was. People just did not want to be flying on that anniversary. I remember, for that first year, probably sitting there thinking, I'm not falling asleep on this flight. If anything moved toward the cockpit, I looked to see what it was. There was a psychological impact from that event that I think for quite a long time. Things bounced back and we recovered more quickly, certainly than the industry has from the pandemic, but I don't know that there'll ever be as much something with the psychological impact that did. I mean, I'd sit on a plane and I'd start to think about the people that were on those flights on the World Trade Center, and the Pentagon, and in some of the cases, I don't even know that people on that plane knew what was happening until their lives had ended. So, I think it took an emotional resilience to, I think, for the whole world to kind of come back, especially in the United States, just to get back to bringing life back to, trying to have things go back to normal, flying chiefly among them. You had to be willing to realize that there was a lot of anxiety and fear and still, and I'm not saying that like it was a heroic thing, but it took an emotional resilience to come back from that I don't think anything else I've seen, that's hit the industry in my career required.
Yeah. Well, I had an unusual experience. I think it was 2 years after 9/11, and I found myself in, I think it was the Sprint building next to the Trade Center. I can't remember if that's what it's called or not, but it's right next. It's one of the buildings that surrounds those two, and things had been cleaned up just enough that people were back, and many of those buildings were shut down forever and had to be remodeled with the whole project. But there was one, I think it was the Sprint building, if I'm correct. I should check that. But we were in a building that was open, and the woman that we were meeting with, the rep and me, we were talking, and she suddenly got quiet and was just staring out the window. She'd turned around and was staring out the window, and it was really odd, and she just went quiet, and we waited and said, are you all right, so-and-so? And she said, forgive me, I sat and watched the first plane go into the Trade Center, or maybe it was the second, but I assume it's the first because she probably left after that, but she watched one of the planes right next to it from that window up, how many stories, I can't remember, but maybe 100 stories or so. And wow, what a front row seat to have, and she lived through it. And so it's kind of a miracle she was there at all a few years later. And it's quite something to listen to her tell the story. Quite a dramatic historical moment in our U.S. history, for sure. Parting shot. I know that you're a big wrestler, and you're a rugby player like I am. You're a champion. I'm a champion. Different rugby types or different rugby levels and such, but we both love rugby. I've never wrestled, but I have in junior high, and even those practices about killed me. And so, give us your best analogy from one of those about leading an organization, if you could, depart.
I think when we were talking about earlier, I was telling you, I could write a book about what I learned, everything I need to know I learned from kindergarten. I could write that about wrestling, as a young man. I don't probably, as far as anything that I did as a young person extracurricularly, in a non-academic pursuit, that probably prepared me more for my career than anything else. A couple of things, simple things with wrestling. You're on a team, but you're completely by yourself. So you learn to be comfortable with losing and to see the value in losing. Because you don't have anybody else to blame. So the only way to get better is to be very realistic with yourself. There's no, I actually hated playing football after a while after I'd wrestled, because there was a lot of, team sports. These guys are lightweights. A lot, it's blaming each other. You missed this. You didn't do that. We all have to do our job. Okay, that's fine. But there's not enough self-reflection and kind of self-examination. Wrestling requires that. And, maybe tennis is the same as others. But the other thing with wrestling is it's also interesting because it's really human. It's like chess with your body against someone else. It is, you've learned quickly that you don't have to always be stronger or faster or smarter, but if you have one of those things that gives you enough of an advantage, it's really kind of testing out and figuring out what advantage do I have that can exceed my opponents just enough for me to beat them. Another interesting thing is leverage. That's also with rugby too, right? So much of wrestling from the physics standpoint is simply leverage. It's not strength. It's not speed. It's knowing exactly how to exactly how to make someone lose leverage and therefore not be able to balance anymore, therefore not be able to prevent themselves from being turned over and pinned. There's a lot of emotional resilience and endurance. I think we're joking, 6 minutes on a wrestling mat is tougher than playing 10 football games as far as physical exhaustion. And at a certain point, so many matches, and I hate to admit, I probably lost as many as I won, but there were so many points in a wrestling match where you just knew it was about, because I can vividly remember multiple times where earlier I just said I could feel that I quit. And then later when I became much better by my last year in wrestling, I remember when I realized all I needed to do was not quit. And that was an interesting, maybe one of the most important lessons from wrestling was at a certain point when you're both completely exhausted and tired, it just becomes a matter of will. And, it's just taught me a lot of I think about that a lot more than I ever expected that I would. All those little simple lessons, there's times not in just my career, but in my personal life, I really quickly, I know, you're short on time too, but I interviewed for a job a few months ago, CEO position in a place in Florida. And it was one of the best questions the interviewer ever asked me. The chairman of the board there said, "Have you ever been fired from a job?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Good. I'm not going to interview I don't want to hire anybody that's never been fired from a job." And I thought that man was brilliant. I mean, it was one of the best questions I've ever heard. Because so often we look at, failure, and everybody can quote Edison saying it probably 900 times in different ways, but failure teaches us far more than success does. And it is the gateway to so many future successes. And I think that was probably one of the best things about wrestling was that it made me very comfortable with failure and comfortable with crisis and comfortable with the fact that like we were talking earlier about the pandemic, when you're in that situation, there's kind of no playbook. You have to become very comfortable with rewriting it and coming up with a whole new one. And I wouldn't have had the same life I had without that sport. And I don't mean that to be melodramatic. It taught me some really tough things in a really effective way.
Great thoughts. Hey, I want to thank you for helping us travel around quicker and safer and faster and around this country. And now you're doing it for many people instead of just Ontario. Well, what an important thing for our economy and for our joy in travel. And I want to thank you for doing that work and being with me today.
Thank you, Mark. It's been wonderful.
I hope to see you again soon. Thank you for joining us to get leaders unstuck and thriving with their teams. You've heard a little bit about the power of bold encounters and leadership. Watch on. Go to full episodes with the iconic expert interviews at markspencercook.com/podcast. And please subscribe. My site takes you directly to YouTube video and podcast versions. Please make comments. Share this with your friends. Also, reach out to us to just brainstorm your priorities, challenges, events, or how bold encounters might help. Visit windfallpartners.com. Click the Let's Talk button without obligation and reach out. I look forward to speaking. Thank you for joining us. Now, let's lead with bold encounters today.